Start it up.
Family names are powerful, stained with laughter, unique skills, and raw talent. More times than not, we see that wealth lacks in Black families. We have an abundance of soul, joy, and rhythm, which should not be taken for granted or tossed aside. But financial resources and money keeps the ball rolling. Pressuring a child to go to school and earn well and to provide for an entire family kills individual passions and dreams. Now, I understand the desire to pass the torch to younger generations. I find it admirable and honorable. But as long as there are systematic institutions and barriers that prevent Black and Brown people from attaining wealth, family names is all that we have to pass along. These barriers insist that children who do not know where they're going to sleep tonight or do not know where they're going to get their next meal from have no excuse to why they are performing not so well in school. It's a matter of equality and equity. Our kids can perform just as well, if not better, if they were given the basic resources and just given patience. It seems like everyone deserves patience besides those who need it the most. In the music, in the music where we holler the lyrics of financial illiteracy and the pleasures of instant gratification, our slowly churned dreams turn into melted pleasures. Before we have learned to maintain and elevate, as I walk the streets and gaze at the murals, I admire the beauty in the places where horror has only been shown. Money seems to flow in and out of neighborhoods, much like a stream, one that doesn't stop or backpedal for anything. It's simply on a mission. Let's make it our mission to educate ourselves and others in how to live in these circumstances, how to elevate in these circumstances, and how to break out once again and create for ourselves, regardless of these circumstances. Let's transfer knowledge and eventually, again, transfer wealth so we can have powerful family names and wealth to pass down. Thank you.
What's going on, good people? Welcome to Common Conversations. I'm your boy, Miguel. I get to be hostess with the mostest, and I appreciate y'all being here. So we're going to hang out a little bit. We're going to have a cool conversation, talk about a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I hope that when you walk away today, you are evoked to study more and to take action and to build some action. And so this is part of a series of conversations that Missy and I have started locally, as well as attempting to live stream. So if the live stream goes bad, rest assured we are recording and we will be able to upload these again later. And so this particular conversation is about Black ecosystems. How do we build Black economics? How do we build resources and safety nets in our community? So whether you're here in Jeffersonville or you are in Timbuktu, right? This will be a space where we can learn and have authentic conversations. And so I welcome you. Two very brilliant people who said yes to my crazy. And I really appreciate Nikki and Malcolm for being here, Dr. Malcolm and Dr. Nikki, let's say that correctly, for being here today. And I'm gonna ask them to forgive me because I have been on a tour and I am extremely exhausted. So Tuesday we had a speech at Ivy Tech. And then from there, we went to Virginia to have a speech that morning. And then I drove back here. I got here last night. We loaded the truck. And unfortunately, some folks are stuck in Lala. So we ended up setting this up as fast as we could. And everything has been on time somewhere else. So I just want to say all of that. But as we dip in here, we are going to talk. Let's just do this. Nikki, will you introduce yourself? Tell the world who you are, because this is like the most brilliant, beautiful, intellectual woman I know. I mean, just amazing, and all things economic and smart.
Oh God, stop it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Miguel, for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Very excited to have any conversation advancing racial equity, and particularly getting a chance to talk about that in the context of economics is an added treat. So my name is Nikki Lanier, and I'm the CEO of HarperSlade Racial Equity Advisory. We are a firm focused on helping organizations cultivate Black and brown talent as a macroeconomic imperative. We see that as not one of, but the macroeconomic imperative of our lifetime, given the demographic trends.
All right, so Dr. Malcolm so you're originally from Louisville, right?
I lived in Louisville for 5 years. I'm from Detroit.
All right, so he's originally from Detroit, lived in Louisville, but now you're in Atlanta, right? So
Now I'm in Atlanta.
he flew in just for us. That might be a lie, but I'm just gonna say he taxied in.
I definitely did.
All right, let's go. So he taxied in just for this conversation, y'all. Super privileged. But Doc, will you tell him a little bit about yourself?
So I moved from Louisville to Atlanta in February. I finished my Ph.D. in entrepreneurship at the University of Louisville, and I'm now the vice president for engagement and outcomes at the Russell Innovation Center for Entrepreneurs in Atlanta, Georgia, where we support over 300 Black entrepreneurs who are trying to grow and scale their businesses. So we surround them with curriculum, with advisors, and with holistic support to develop successful businesses.
Let's go. Let's get it. So part of this conversation for me comes from a handful of books that I've been reading, and really just the journey locally as an entrepreneur. And what I've learned in the time of being in Southern Indiana specifically is that you don't find a lot of Black entrepreneurs who are not in service business. And when I say service business, I mean a beauty salon, a barber, in that space, or cook and or cleaning, right? So it's rare to find attorneys. It's rare to find architects, folks who are in different industries and different scale. And so it's kind of hard to find like-minded people. And as I began this space, I spent a lot of time with white folks in Chamber of Commerce or board committees. And what I realized is that there is a limitation to the resources that are available, right? And so it's hard to be competitive if you remove color, right? Actually, it's just hard to be competitive because we all see color, and that becomes a thing. And so as we started this journey, it started talking about how do we get access to resources, how do we find resources, and then I started reading one of these books. So I have these up here as cues and markers for me, and The Color of Money is the one I just finished, and so. A couple years back, I was studying banking and why we didn't see a lot of Black banks in the area. And the one particular Black bank that we had was in Louisville, and it was struggling, like many Black banks. But this is a great book because it really starts to talk about the lineage and the heritage and the history of what was happening in this country as it relates to economics, right? As it relates to banking, the Nixon era, what was happening to a lot of our Black leaders in the community who believed in entrepreneurship and banking and economics. And so we're sitting here and I'm thinking, we have to, I'll say this, Malcolm said it best, Black folks need to control and own their own resources. And that's true to date. And in terms of as we start seeing and putting out there new businesses and new opportunities, I also want to lead, before I get into this question, is sometimes we live in this debt society. And African Americans traditionally have been put in an enslaved relationship economically, and that hasn't really changed. We're in the week of Juneteenth, and we're talking about the freedom that was given to those in Texas. And what we don't also talk about is that there were still slaves in the United States almost 2 to 3 years later in the North as well as in the South. And so although our bodies were free economically, we're still not part of the system. And it seems like there's rules, right, that keep us from there. And so getting into the conversation is how do we begin to build our own? How do we build that trust? So when we're talking about wealth in the future and things of that nature, Nikki, your background in banking and at the Fed, and you're also, is it lawyer by degree, right? How do I do that? Okay, yeah. And you're the CEO of a D&I company who focuses on this. What are if there was one thought that came to mind right now and said, how do we build Black ecosystems, what would it be?
So, I mean, it's so complex, especially given the preface that you just shared. There is a calcified, very rigid, very opaque, thick reality within which Black hopes and dreams must find themselves. Like, how do we navigate and give life to the manifestation of our hopes and dreams? And it's almost always been entirely dependent on the white letting of resources in order to activate those. So I'm in full agreement that there clearly is there's an economic, if not ideological, reality that has to suggest, has to mandate almost a bounty of Black resources available to activate the fullness of Black and brown potency and the manifestation of the way that we dream and the way that we hope. So I guess I'd say, to boil it all down, on some level, it's mindset. It is the belief and the expectation that Black and brown people ought and must and deserve full access to the fundamentals of our economy and the American dream. I think that somewhere in the recesses of all of our minds, many of us still don't really believe that. We believe it on some level as a lofty goal. Maybe we feel like it's unattainable. It's way too complicated to get to it. But I think that just understanding that it is necessary, and not just to remediate all the ills of slavery and all the ills of the various ways that marginalization, muting, stunting, and diminishment of Black and brown has manifested, but it's also for a macroeconomic well-being, given the demographic trends, right? So what I talk about a lot in my work is that it is an unsustainable model to think about cultivating a civilized society where the majority of your citizen body is exempted from the fundamentals of how the economy works. So said differently, we have only known, since we humans have been traversing this country, traversing this world, we have only known a narrative that has assigned deficit to Black and brown existence. I mean, that's manifested differently. In some ways, it's slightly less watered down than arguably it has been in the past, but we have never been free. We've been free-ish. And so there's a cost, though, to that when you think about the browning of the country. We talk about that a lot. Like, people are always like, 2045, will be majority, minority, blah, 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 and we end the sentence there. But then what does that mean economically for all of us, all human beings, all of us, to live in a society where the majority of our citizens have only contextualized their way into mattering? It's almost like an apartheid model. So anyway, I think I'd say that just the understanding, the belief system, not just with Black and brown, but among all of us, that, as John Yarmouth has said before, it is in all of our best interests that Black and brown America thrive.
Yeah, so I come at it from a very specific perspective, right? So I'm always going to think of it in terms of, as highly promoted and as highly touted as like entrepreneurial activity is for regenerating communities. I think that there's a lot of things that we leave out of that conversation in terms of what is it about entrepreneurship that'll help resolve some of these issues that we're talking about, right? And so if we think about entrepreneurship in the term of mainstream economics, the way that we generally think about it, it typically just focuses on individual success of one business, right? And that's not really going to get us very far, right? So I start to think about alternative or non-traditional forms of economic thought in terms of how I promote, entrepreneurial activity, especially in Black communities, and how we can use it to turn around some of our fortunes and some of our outcomes. And within that, it's about, and this goes specifically to my work at the Russell Center in Atlanta, and helping to, what are the benefits of so many entrepreneurs pursuing so many powerful goals and financial outcomes, being so closely located to one another. And for me, that's the genesis of an economy, right? When you have so many people pursuing all of these financial outcomes in such close proximity, there's so much power and potential in that goes beyond how we traditionally think about economics and how we traditionally think about building ecosystems, right? And so for us, it's about we've come to the point where how do you lower the cost of doing business? So when we get to talk about the barriers and the structural inequities and the forces that are at play that keep us locked out of a lot of opportunities, in that case, that means it's the job of entrepreneurs and organizations like us that support entrepreneurs to help overcome some of those challenges, right? And so when you think about the opportunity to address some of those barriers by having entrepreneurs so closely located together, it in our mind, it comes down to lowering costs, right? So you're much closer to customers, you're much closer to potential suppliers, you're much closer to contracts and all types of opportunities that traditionally, if you're out operating in a vacuum, you'll have to put a lot more effort, a lot more resources, a lot more time to securing those resources. So I think in building an economy and building an ecosystem that is self-sustainable and can thrive on its own, it's really about leveraging and maximizing those connections. And how do we find interdependence and find complementarity between entrepreneurs and not just say we're trying to make individual entrepreneurs successful, but we're trying to lift the tide for all of them.
I like that. And that's an entrepreneurial community, right? That where resources are being spread through and shared. And you're a little different because you're in Atlanta, and I think different spaces are going to have opportunities and access in a different way. And Atlanta's kind of a mecca, right? There are a lot of us in that space. And traditionally, if you're not familiar, Atlanta was an experiment. And a little over 100 years ago, where Coca-Cola and a handful of what we'll identify as anchor institutions came together during segregation and Jim Crow and said, hey, we're not going to allow the whiteness and the ills of America destroy our economic system. And so they came together with Black leaders and said, how do we put things in place so that we're making sure that we're sustaining an ecosystem, right? They built that. And that is one of the greatest experiments because if you study it and you see it, you're watching it flourish. And it's not that Atlanta doesn't have its issues, but you're getting it right. And so I think bringing that here, when we're sitting here in Jeff or Louisville, that experience is a little different. And, I think we have pieces of that maybe, but in that sense, it's margin. So I wonder is there an idea of if we could plant a seed here, right here in this region, what might be a way or an idea? Can we free think that? Is that possible?
Yeah. So I think that it's important to think about what the specific differences are between a place like Louisville and a place like Atlanta, because honestly, I think there's pros and cons to both, right? Most of what I know and what I've observed about ecosystems from an academic perspective comes from Louisville. Like I was in Louisville for 5 years and I just got to Atlanta, right? So most of what I think about ecosystems comes from what I saw happening in Louisville, right? And so I was just having this conversation yesterday with Kiana actually, and she was talking about what are actually the strengths of the Louisville ecosystem that we actually don't have in Atlanta. And one of the biggest pieces of that is the cohesiveness, right? So like in Louisville, you kind of can know that you can go to a Story Louisville or something like that, and you can cross paths with most of the major players in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? Atlanta doesn't really have that. Like Rice, which is the Russell Center where I work, has the potential to be a hub like that for the city of Atlanta, but there's so many other places that could also be a hub, right? And so it's much probably less cohesive than a Louisville ecosystem because there's so many separate areas, there's so many distinct areas, and it's much harder to make those connections, right? But at the same time, imagine if an Atlanta could make those connections, because on the flip side, Atlanta has, honestly much more resources to offer entrepreneurs, especially Black entrepreneurs, to your point, than other areas might have. And so it's like a catch-22, right? It's like you have the cohesiveness or you have the resources. And so the challenge is, where do you find that middle ground to blend the two? And I want to touch on, kind of what you said too, because what you said about Atlanta rings very true in my head, because I'm learning so much just by being at the Russell Center, right? The Russell Center is named after Herman J. Russell, right? One of the, most famous, most prominent entrepreneurs that that city has ever produced, right? And so when you talk about that Coca-Cola, the building of the Coca-Cola headquarters, Herman J. Russell and Company was one of the either the general contractor or one of the subcontractors that worked on building that building, right? And so if you dive deep into the history of Herman J. Russell, you'll learn about his role in really building Atlanta to be the Black Mecca as it is, right? Because you can look at 50% of the Atlanta skyline now, and Herman J. Russell Company his name was somewhere on a contract to build those buildings, right? And he used those opportunities to create more opportunities for not only, construction entrepreneurs coming underneath him, but other types of businesses that he branched out into. So if you ever get a chance, he wrote a book called Building Atlanta, and it talks through that story of how Atlanta developed and how he was so successful at integrating. Because I think that's the part that you touched on is it wasn't a Black thing versus a white thing in Atlanta. It was, let's come together and stand out from the rest of the country and show that we can come together and work together to build businesses together and build an economy together. So it's powerful stuff. I definitely recommend it.
Thank you. And you're right. I mean, the key to that is inclusion, right? And having, really common ground, whether you're Black or white, and what the intent of what's going to be done. Nikki is someone for me who kind of represents all the things we're talking about. She is someone who bridges people, brings folks together, has been a resource, and has that common mind. And so I'm going to stay in this space, but also kind of switch and think, Nikki, what do you see and what have you seen when we talk about whether it's Louisville, the region, development for Black entrepreneurs, the cohesion that exists? Because you have a program that you do nationally, right? That brings Black entrepreneurs together and those thought leaders. What have you seen, and what is your experience and thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. The city in which the incubation of Black Hope and Dream manifested as like Black business, it matters, right? The environment in which this seed is to be planted, it matters because of what it gives birth to. So if you think about, I use a lot of analogies around gardening in my work. So if you think about like the region that you're in as the soil, some soil is just more malleable, some is more hardened to these kinds of ideals, this ideal of amplifying and activating Black entrepreneurial ecosystems and assuring that we're not, I don't mean this in a bemoaning way, that we're not just focused on Black businesses as service businesses, but thinking about Black entrepreneurs as engines of wealth building for themselves, for our progeny, for the community. Just thinking about that. To be blunt, there are just regions of the country that are more ripe to that thinking than others. So that you find yourself, I would say, in my experience, in regions like ours, spending as much time selling the idea of supporting a hope and dream from a Black person as you do mobilizing that hope and dream, versus what I've seen in some other cities that don't have the same kind of segregation that we do in our city, that don't have the same kind of schizophrenic experiences and background with slavery that we do in this region, where it's just easier. I don't know how else to say it. It just is easier to get that traction, to get that access to capital, to get the support systems activated, to be around like-minded folks who are supporting your work. I'm not talking about just Black and brown like-minded. I'm talking about everybody is working toward assuring that whomever has not thrived is now thriving. That's just not the mindset en masse, particularly of the old guard in our region. And so it becomes a little more difficult, especially in the financial services sector, which tends to be the most besieged under the weight of narrow-mindedness, unilateral, myopic thinking. I mean, it just is. And it's not any bank in particular, it's just financial services as a whole has just caused so much harm to Black and brown people since its inception, and has not really figured out a way to dig itself out of that. It's probably one of the most conservative, industries that there is. And yet that is the very industry that many of us Black entrepreneurs must pass through in order to activate what we're hoping for. So it does vary by region, and I just, from what I'm hearing, and with the Black businesses that are starting here, it just is harder. My own experience, I sell for a living the idea that the amplification and acceleration of Black and brown talent is an economic imperative for our country. Many in our region don't buy that, don't want to purchase that mobilization. So most of my clients are outside. They're just everywhere else but Kentucky and Indiana. But I recognize that it's an ideological battle. It's a kind of a philosophical and experiential battle. There's an anchoring around sameness and familiarity, relatability that many who have grown up inside of segregation know to be safe. It is safe when I am around same. It is safe when I'm around familiar and around that which I know only. And this is also one of the areas in our country where you can kind of excel in your career and in your life, anchored to that thinking. You can't take that thinking to Atlanta. And it doesn't work there because you're just around multiculturalism, multidimensioned, and well-traveled and well-read, and people with incredible pedigree from all over the world and all over, well-educated, everybody, not just white, but everybody is credentialed. And so you're accustomed to engaging with and colliding with difference without the presumption of deficit. So to me, it's just as hard. It's murkier in this region to try to navigate entrepreneurial systems.
I would absolutely agree on that. It is murky, and you're right. Like I'm just coming back from Virginia, and we were having a conversation on if you could rebuild the economy the way you want it, what would it look like? And so we spent 8 minutes of discovery. Then we spent a 40-minute conversation of really trying to unpack 6 or 7 key questions, right? And what I learned relatively fast in the room was that everybody was highly educated. The room was predominantly Black, which I find even more interesting. But that's the makeup of that space. When I do these things here, we find and so let me change this. We find both an educated group of folks. We find a very degreed group of folks. And then I also find uneducated in both of those spaces. And so when I say educated, I mean self-learners, people who explore ideas, they read text, they do their own research and discovery. When I say degree, they've gone to college or somewhere and they've gotten a series of degrees. I've learned that there are some very degreed, uneducated people. There are also some very educated people who aren't degreed. And then I've found some very ignorant folks in both groups, right? And so when we talk about Black ecosystems and entrepreneurship here, it's a hard conversation. It's one to have, and then 2 to get people into the space where we can really start processing what the issue might be, so that we can come up with solutions. So I say that, and I'm going to lead into in Southern Indiana specifically. There's really no MBE, WEBE program. So if you're not familiar with an MBE or WBE program, these are women-owned minority business enterprise certifications that you can get that allude to being able to level the economic playing field and giving women-owned and Black-owned businesses an opportunity that would not otherwise be there. And I say allude because I personally think these programs are scarcity programs. They come with a scarcity mindset. So when we talk about mindset, for me, we tell people who have gone out there and they've put their moniker and they've gone through and done all the things they need to do to build a business. And if they're Black, then we say, go get certified. And now you'll have an opportunity to talk to someone, to have an opportunity to maybe have an opportunity, right? And we know traditionally, whether you're in Louisville or you're in Southern Indiana, if there is a goal, those goals are rarely met. And we say, hey, we don't know where the Black-owned businesses are. So I'm going to get to a point. The point I'm making is, and this is more of the question, if we can take 60 seconds and explore it, how do we create a space where we can find all the thought leaders in that room and really try to solve the scarcity mindset and change it? Is there something just free thought? Would y'all be willing to do that with me?
Yeah. So I come from a research background, and those type of things happen all the time. So I was in Boston for the Diana International Research Institute Impact Day, and it was kind of exactly what you're talking about. Not necessarily the same audience, but it was focused around women's entrepreneurship. And so they convene researchers, practitioners, policymakers, investors to come and almost hackathon style or, group brainstorm around the pressing issues, right? And that's really, as researchers, that's really what we try to do. We attempt to answer the hardest questions, right? And so if you put all of the right people in a room, in a space, and guide them into exploring the right questions, then it's risky, right? Because you're doing it without knowing what the outcome is going to be, and you don't know how worthwhile the effort is going to be put into it. But it's about, I think, in that case, just being willing to take the risk and being willing to flop a couple of times, because like what you're asking is difficult, right? Like that's a tall task, and so there's going to be hiccups along the way. And I think that's the hurdle we got to get over, is being willing to withstand those instances where you might not get as far as you would like, but still moving in the right direction. And so I think what you said is really just, like you said, bringing the people together. It's as simple as that, and guiding the conversation in the right way.
Okay. I appreciate that.
This is so layered in my view, in my mind. So scarcity is rooted in competition. And in our kind of evolution, as we've evolved as humans at this point, competition is the only way we can think about competition as humans at this point is I win, you lose. Like it's harder for us to really orient our behaviors and our thinking around we win. It's hard for we love to think about it, but it's just not how we're wired. It's always I win, you lose. And so especially when you think about access to capital, access to funding, access to resources, access to business opportunities, which for Black and brown folks has been episodic, always heavily contextualized, always lots and lots of conditions. The credentialing around certification is one that also drives me absolutely nuts, because of the process to go through and like you got to go. I'm a Black-owned business, but I got to get certified to say that I'm a. Anyway, it feels silly, but beyond that, what it then invokes is now I get to stand in line. Right, I got my certification. So now I get the privilege of standing in line for someone potentially whose drive is to comply with their minority spend requirements, not necessarily to understand how my business might add value for their business, right? And so I think it feeds a dark side of humanity in some ways. I mean, I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but it feels odd to me that the invocation of how business is sometimes accessed, given all of these certifications, and then you stand in line to compete, and then you compete means, if you get the contract, then that means I don't, because, what's the likelihood that a business, particularly a business incubated inside of segregation, is going to pick two Black-owned businesses when all they got to do is one for their right to check the box there. So it just drives a kind of compliance mindset that I think is also doing a disservice to us as human beings. I'd love for us to move more toward a commitment kind of ideological construct as we're thinking about how we've been taught to value other human beings, to be able to talk about that in public spaces and to be very clear about it without absorbing any guilt or shame about it. It's just what we've been taught about the value of humans. And so that value brings all this competition that breeds the scarcity mindset.
Can I build on that? Because I want to talk about like what you just said about that we win mindset instead of I win, right? Because I think this idea of competition versus collaboration really gets me excited. Like I'm a firm believer that we all could benefit. Every single one of us in this room could benefit from being a little bit more selfless, right? Because there's a lot of examples. So one is in entrepreneurship, right? Like we all kind of want to be the top dog, right? We want to. So if I'm founding a company, the next person is more likely to want to go found their own company rather than recognizing that that founder needs a very strong number two to get where they need to go, right? And there's not enough number twos out here. As important as that number two is, there's not enough of them. And then you can go back to the Herman J. Russell example, right? For his construction company, he was a subcontractor, right? So there was a general contractor that won the bid, and he wasn't too arrogant to accept subcontractor roles. And right, so that concept of being a subcontractor, we can probably apply that in all of our work, right? Like we don't need to always be the boss in everything, right? It's about being strategic in your deference, right? And being willing to be number two. And another example, right? So we can be competing for contracts, right? I could be competing for a $1.5 million contract, right? They're going to award one company $1.5 million, right? Or if you come in together, we'll give y'all $4 million together. People will still take that 1.5 just because it's my contract instead of splitting this $4 million contract. And we come out with more, right? And not enough of us are thinking that way and being willing to collaborate and sacrifice being the top dog or being the main one in everything that we do. And I think that's the shift. So when you talk about shifting mindsets, but it also comes down to educating, right? You got to be able to educate on how to shift and why to shift mindsets too. So I feel real strongly about that.
No, I like that. Shifting mindset and collaborating. I mean, because what you're talking about is key. Definitely in the MBE program. So to give you an example, if you're not familiar with it, if you're watching or if you're in here, so MBE programs will say, hey, we're going to go out and say we've got a $100 million project. And Mark, this is kind of the thing that really happens. And we're going to say, well, we're going to create a goal of 15% that we're going to try to spend with businesses that are non-white, right? Who exist in that BIPOC space, who have now gone out through these other leaps and gotten certified and have proved that they're BIPOC, right? And so then they'll do something called due diligence, like in our city, they'll put it in a newspaper and say, hey, we did our due diligence, we stuck it in a newspaper, and we went out and saw it to find 50, the minority businesses who can actually do this contract, and we're going to attempt, because they don't actually award. They're going to attempt to award 15% of whatever that $115,000 budget or $100 million budget is, right? The challenge with that is I always find is that you go out and you round up, 400,000 minority-owned businesses, and then you're saying, well, we're only going to give you access to 15% of the project, not 85. You don't actually get to go after 100% of the project. And minority programs in itself creates, that a mindset where we can't collaborate. You're pitting the least of us against each other for the least of the opportunity, and those opportunities typically aren't met, right? So it's hard to change mindset in that relationship, but we do have to. And I think what you're also saying is that in that sense, we also as Black-owned businesses have to be creative in that space. We've got to find a way to collaborate, to go after, if we're in that MBE space, so that we can collaborate and go after those larger contracts. And that takes some time and opportunity for us to educate ourselves in that sense. So I also think about this too, and Nikki, I think this you may have a greater answer, because there's a cost to all of this. There's a cost to consistently marginalizing your community, both in majority businesses, minority businesses, and the community as a whole, and our municipalities. When we can and I'll paraphrase it, because I think it was Baldwin around 64 or so at one of his debates talked about the idea of growing America and this concept of equality. Baldwin said, it will be the people that are consistently held down that ultimately destroy the very thing everybody's trying to keep, right? And it will be an unintentional situation. And I don't think anybody really in this world, in America, we all love America, even in its flaws, wants to see that. But I want to just for a second, talk about what are the costs to not seeing us as a whole,
Racism is expensive. So it is easier to believe, because it has always been a part of the common ether, the common conversation, to presume that the lot that Black and brown people find themselves in, Black people specifically, is of our doing. Choice, that we are choice poor because of the choices that we've made. And, you know, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps argument that I know I hear a lot. I don't know everybody else, but it's a lot. So this idea of the presumption that you have the same opportunities, Black folk, to find your way to the American dream as white folk. And because of the persistent bad choices that you've made and that your parents have made and that their parents have made, that's why you're in this particular area. That's why you're in this particular economic strata. 2021, Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco studied that exact question to really determine what is the root of inequity, not inequality, but inequity that Black and brown suffer under, such that the entire country really start paying attention. And so the Fed did this amazing quantifiable study where they pulled out choice, right? So if all things being equal, if you have Black and brown and then white, same education, same background or similar background, similar choices made from, I think it was like 8th grade on, in terms of, you know, not getting into trouble in school, no detention. What is the economic outcomes are still extraordinarily different. Quantified as this, since 1990, we have lost $55 trillion in GDP due to structural and institutional inequity against Black people and Hispanic people. And so that number will only climb as the demographic trends climb. As we become Blacker and browner, that number gets higher and higher. And so that's why I talk about, like, in whose interest is it really that Black and brown America thrive? It's really all of our interest. And the reason why I'm so emphatic on that point is because policy setting, from a monetary policy standpoint and a fiscal policy standpoint, heavily rely on the health of the middle class of our country in setting policy. And so the middle class of the country really must be, has always been, and should likely forever be populated by whomever is the majority available, right? Now, we've always had the benefit of having the most and the least encumbered people by race in our country populating the majority and therefore populating the middle class, i.e. white people. Now we are going to have the most encumbered having to populate the middle class. And this is significant because Black and Hispanic households have never been represented in the middle class meaningfully, ever. And so that has to change in just 22 years, by 2045. And so when we think about the cost at the $56 trillion mark now, where we're not the majority in the available workforce, at least, or decidedly the majority among adults, when we do become the majority, that number will quadruple. And then what does that mean for the economic outcomes, the macroeconomic policy standpoint, fiscal policy standpoint? What does that mean for the well-being of our country? So that's why I think it's really important for us at this dispensation in time to understand the cumulative cost of what we have all inherited. We didn't do it per se. The people who are drawing breath today didn't do it. We didn't create this, but we've inherited it. And we stand the most to lose, as do our children and their children, if we, this group of humans, can't correct it.
I want us to chew on that. I want the room to process that for a minute, right? And then I want to open it up for a couple questions, because the reality of it is that if we don't focus and make changes at all, we lose it all anyway when it comes down to it. So there's a cost on both sides, and we all inherited the situation that we're in, and because within cost there's opportunity, I do want that mic is available if someone would like to step up if you've got questions to this part or any part of this as we go through this journey together. So when we think about the cost, when we think about potential opportunity, when we think about creating systems in our community that will allow us all to thrive together. And I know we come together today talking about Black ecosystems specifically, but understand there's also an idea that when we win, we all win, right? And that has been customary in the history of the U.S., right? And so when you think about that, and we're saying, okay, in different spaces, whether you're in an Atlanta or you're in Boston or Louisville, there's going to be different opportunities and different makeups. But the fact of the matter is the cost is across the board. Based on the things that we may or may not have here, where do y'all see opportunity for us to begin to focus at a local, or is there an opportunity? Like, are we so far gone that we can't do a thing? And maybe one or two ideas or three, what are some things we could potentially start doing here?
I would say we have to take a long-term view and focus on, again, education, but specifically educating the youth, right? Because when you talk about changing mindsets and changing behavior at the level of the youth, it's more about shaping mindsets and shaping behavior. So if you can invest in teaching the right values and the right philosophies and the right ideologies at that level where it's easier to learn and easier to absorb it, then it's about moving towards the changes that you might not necessarily be able to see in your lifetime, but producing changes for future generations and giving them the opportunity to really make a huge impact and a huge difference. So that's where I focus a lot of my time is like, how do I teach entrepreneurship and teach economic thought in a way that is digestible to the youth? And how can I lead them in the right direction along the lines of the conversations we've been having all day, right? It's like, how can we get them thinking that way so that it's not this hard for them to...
At what age do you start? Because I know a lot of people are like, oh, they got to get to high school, but...
No, I mean, I did probably 2 summers ago, I did a summer camp for like middle school age students, right? And my main takeaway from that camp was, I think we are the ones that constrain the possibilities for them. Like we say things like, oh, that's too much for them to comprehend, or that's too much for them to grasp. But if you give them opportunity, they'll show you that you're possibly thinking too small for them, right? Because it was a week-long summer camp, and we took them through the idea of social entrepreneurship and how you can use your innovation and your creativity to really make a change. And they really care about this stuff. Like, they care about the challenges and the issues that we're facing, and they want to develop solutions for those things. So they really need the coaching and the leadership and the guidance, and for us not to be like, oh, you're too young to grasp that, but instead feed them what they're asking for, right? And allow them to express their own unique identity and personality and creativity, and just feed it and hone it, because I think we're the ones that's limited them. It's not that they are inherently limited.
I guess I'll speak more to Louisville because I'm more familiar with the kind of the dynamics and the tapestry on that side of the river. I think Louisville. Well, first of all, let me give my preface to what I'm about to say. Of course, the largest, this may not be well known, but the largest majority population in Louisville is Black. The largest turnover population for Louisville is also Black. And so I think it's in Louisville's interest to assure retaining of Black and Hispanic talent, given the demographic trends, right? I mean, I think it's going to be critical to grow for any city to maintain a fairly healthy complement of Black and brown, Black specifically, and Hispanic specifically talent. So I think Louisville should develop, or this region, so maybe like from under the chambers, 1SI and GLI coming together to develop a 50-year Black economic development plan, or strategy with racial equity at the center of it that is mobilized and activated by citizen body from both sides of the river, all hues, not just black and brown, but just everyone invested in, again, the accelerated amplification of people of color economically. But I do think that it's going to be important to think about I did the racial equity, and I'm going to be so bold to offer the way that I define it, which is as follows: proportional fairness that takes into consideration the cultural and historic realities that have beset people of color uniquely, as distinct from all other people, and works to remedy the same. So it has to this plan has to have a sense of proportional fairness, specifically for Black and brown people, that understands historically what has happened uniquely and solely to Black and brown people in our country, and is remedial. And so where I've seen that happen is coming off the heels of other cities that have had similar worries and concerns about retaining Black talent. Miami, Florida is a great example. Where years and years ago, they had all the boycotts. You probably remember after Mandela came and they didn't give him the key to the city. It was the whole thing. Black folks lost their minds down there and just pulled all their money out of Miami Beach and parts of Dade County. What came out off of that was an organization called MAP, Metro Miami Action Plan, which is essentially a Black economic development program. It had an amazing ride for like 20, 30 years, something like that. And from that, it birthed so many Black businesses, Black banks, just assuring that there was, resurgence in the Black community development dollars being allocated, and the resurrection of what had been eviscerated by years of economic decline. And so it was a concentrated effort that the entire city leaders, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, everybody came together to mobilize because they saw that as the future for Miami. And that's what I would love to see activated in our area.
I completely agree with that. I don't know that Southern Indiana is much different than Louisville, except for there's less of a thriving professional Black population. And there's not a lot of study down here. I think a lot of that's intentional, but you can see it in the makeup of boards. You can see it in the makeup of commissions and who runs what companies, right? But Southern Indiana as a whole has a hard time retaining talent. And I think a lot of it is because of some Jim Crow beliefs, right? Because even the cost in that relationship, it's neat that you talked about Florida. If I can just bring up real quick, we were driving back from Virginia and I was talking to my wife about making a run on banks, right? And how during the Depression, folks would run to the bank and pull out all their money and the banks would like go bankrupt. And, and we were talking about resetting an economy, and that kind of came out of our pinch of our conversation in Virginia. And, somebody was like, how would you actually reset the economy? And I was like, well, it's not that hard. It's a little complex, but I was like, you do what they used to do. You make a run on a bank, but instead you would make a run on the impact of commercialism in a sense of consumerism, right? So if everybody woke up and didn't go to work for the next 6 months, you would bankrupt most of the companies in this country. You can't technically make a run on a bank anymore because there are laws and regulations and they learn those lessons. But collectively, there's a cost if everybody woke up and said, we're so frustrated. And you saw that in Florida. They were so pissed off. They was like, we know how to make it. We'll just make it stop, right? And sometimes that forces people to really see a thing. It's not always violence. It's not always protesting in the street, but there are ways to do it. And I think we could be proactive in the region if our two chambers would be able to come together and say, hey, this is really important. I've seen some movement from a 1SI. I've seen more movement from a GLI in more recent time to really look at how we build equity and equality, economic equity and equality in our community. I don't know either organization has yet defined it though, and that's something I've been running as I've been having these discussions when we talk about definition, because a lot of us speak words and they don't mean the same to each other. And that was something we talked about in one of our first discussions. But we really have to get down to what does equity really mean and to whom, and then roll out a program that fits that. We have to really kind of strip back some of the policies that exist because we do have a lot of economic discriminating policies. And even sometimes when we're saying, hey, we're trying to change them, it's the same people controlling those policies saying, look, we're going to do something new. And can we really get there? So Nikki, what you're saying, I think is possible and is absolutely something that is needed for our community. We've got a couple more minutes. And so if you've got a question, I want to invite you so that we can do this. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. If we can unmute that mic. Do you need me to shorten that for you? I got you.
I had to tell everybody. Did you just do that?
We don't have a camera on this mic. Usually we do, but so nobody saw me do that.
So my name is Janice, and my question is, I'm from here, Jeffersonville. I had kids young, so I have 5 children, came out of high school, had kids. It was difficult, very difficult, didn't have a plan or anything like that. However, one thing I told my children when they were young, I will not be a statistic. I stayed with my kids. I raised my kids. I worked as best as I could. I took care of my kids. Now they're grown and out the house, have lives of their own. But my question is, how do you reach not only the single mothers, but how do you reach the people to educate them, to get them to the point to where this is great, Miguel, thank you for this, this is amazing, but how do you reach them people? How do you reach them? What you said, Dr. Malcolm, about, start with the children, that was amazing. That was awesome. The program that you talked about, how we should get together, Dr. Nikki, that was amazing. That's awesome. But how do you get the people together to, begin to start that program? And how do you reach those single mothers or those single parents, because men are single parents too, to just get them to change their mindset and begin to sow life into them? How do you reach them to get them to this point?
So I'll kick it off, and I'll say part of that is doing things like this, right? We have to be intentional. And so I live here, and I've been here for almost 20 years, and what I started recognizing were voids, right? I would go to events, and I didn't see the population that you're talking about, single moms. I didn't see a lot of Black women having the opportunity to speak and to share their stories. And I know a lot of the folk. And so one of the things from that said, okay, let's create our women's empowerment program, and let's go intentionally find people who are not getting invited, and then invite them to speak. The other part is so we have programs, we're sitting in CASI. It's going to take nonprofits and for-profits alike in our institutions to invest in that idea. And it's not going to be as successful as everybody wants it in the beginning, but they have to invest. So, I use CASI as an example because we're sitting here. When I said, hey, I'm going to come up with this concept, it is going to be really risque, and it's not going to be popular. And we're going to talk about how we improve the Black community through racial equity and conversation. I need a space. Will you sponsor a space so that we can do a thing? And they said yes, right? That didn't come from everybody. A lot of folks was like, hell nah, stay away from us. So it takes the community to invest in this so that we can do it. And it doesn't always have to be millions of dollars, but the investment has to happen. The people also have to be open to it, right? It's funny because when we were in Virginia, they were having this debate about woke. And I was laughing. I'm like, woke been around for a real long time. That's not new. But one of the gentlemen, it was a guy from Atlanta, and I can't think of his name at the moment, but he told a lady that sometimes, because she was struggling with the concept of woke, and he said, sometimes woke for you might just be being open to something new. And we have to plant those seeds. Nikki has a program called The Garden, and we have to consistently plant seeds. And it's going to take time for people to latch on to the idea that something new can occur. So there's again, a lot of intentionality has to happen. We have to be consistent in showing up and delivering it as well. And we also, my last one, and I'll let y'all jump in. We also have to, as a person who's delivering it, we have to believe that it's it's going to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have 3 thoughts, and I'll keep them brief. The first is the contextualization for the next 2. That is this. There really is nothing, in my opinion, that is intuitive or natural about what we're suggesting here. And this is part of why this is so hard for us to just like, well, people are like, well, why is racism still a thing? And why are we, why can't you? It's because it's not, it's racism is natural to us. It is just naturally who we are. We are naturally excluders. We're naturally prejudiced. We naturally marginalize and assign value toward humans, but we also don't want to talk about it, which also makes it more hard. Because we want to be good. We want to feel good about ourselves and feel like we're good people. In my opinion, both can be true. We can be super great people and also contribute to racism every single day, knowingly or unknowingly. Like, that's just the thing. So for that reason, I think my second point is it is very critical for all of us to advocate till we die for the fullness of history to be taught in our schools. So this is not about CRT. I don't even call it that. I just call it teaching the fullness of American history to include what happened to Black people structurally, historically, and from a policy standpoint. The reason why I say that is because as we advance racial equity, and I think I've made it clear that that is a macroeconomic imperative, the macroeconomic imperative of our lifetime, it is impossible to advance that directive, racial equity, when we don't know anything about racial inequity other than the theory of it, or maybe we watched Roots, or maybe we saw something, right, during Black History Month, but we haven't been taught what happened. So racial equity will always feel like you want something for nothing. You should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It will always feel reparation-y, affirmative action-y in a world that doesn't understand what happened. So that's why teaching the fullness of Black history is so very important. And that legislatively has to happen. It has to. My third point is what I'm doing specifically. And that is, I firmly believe that part of the rescuing framework for how to dig ourselves out of racism rests with white women. And so I am developing a program for white women specifically. It's called the Rare Woman Collective. We launched this year. And it is a nurturing, coaching, year-long experience for white women who are inclined and interested to really learn how to be racial equity advocates in their homes, in their communities, and in the places that they hold, in a way that's curated by Black women for white women to help them in this space, because many want to, but are scared to because they get smacked around by us, folks like us, like, you ain't doing it right, you ain't saying it right, shut up, get off Facebook, right? So we go off on them. Or they're just not, it's like not a place where they have been permitted to or given space to have a voice, but have an opinion, a quiet one, but not a voice. So don't look like, how do I talk about this stuff? So anyway, I think we got to think about like who else can be invoked, should be invoked, because racism affects all of us, not just Black and brown folks. We're all living under the weight of this thing. So I think we should all be empowered to get rid of it.
Yeah, my answer is simply, I think you have to meet people where they are. And so a few examples of that. So think about the Black Panthers. They didn't set up brunches for people in San Francisco, right? They went straight to the hood in Oakland and gave out free breakfast, right? So you got to meet people where they are comfortable if you want to have them accept new thoughts, new ideas, new ways of thinking. You got to go to their environment and go to their space instead of thinking that you can just invite them to your space where they might be uncomfortable. And you can even find examples of that in Louisville, right? So I've been in instances where people wanted to rely on me to get people to come from the West End to go to Nulu, to go to a startup event, right? When like you want me to talk to get this lady to come and learn about tech and how to incorporate tech into her business. She's just trying to learn how to get this jewelry off, right? Like, and like as important as it might be for her to incorporate tech into her business, and as valuable as it might be, you first got to meet her needs and like teach her how to build this jewelry business so that you can get some credibility with her, right? So it's like meet the people where they are, and don't think that the answer is to invite them to your space. Go to their space and figure out how you can help them where they are.
We do. We have to collaborate. We have to have these conversations. And I think at some point we have to also begin to move beyond the conversation, because there's action behind this, and how we're going to shift it. But in order for us to really build what I call a utopia, it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of time. And there are a lot of costs to this, both socially, economically, emotionally, mentally. And when you get into this space, you have to know that and prepare for that. And you can't prepare for all of it, but you do have to prepare for that, and know that, there's going to be a date and time where you will arrive, but we've got to be strong in that sense, and courageous, I think. And so I say all these things because I'd like to definitely thank Nikki and Malcolm for being here today, for coming in and blessing us. I wish we could do more of this, because there's a great way to unpack all of this in a more depth, but we would need 2 or 3 days of a full seminar, and they're not cheap. So one of the things we talk about equity is that we have to find ways to fund and invest, right, in our thought leaders, so that they can begin to come in these spaces and lay out plans and maps, so that we can act on them. So it's super important, and I want to say that because they are here on Sweat Equity and Love right now, and I appreciate that 100%. I appreciate y'all for coming out. So those who, if you had opportunity to watch the stream, shoot us your feedback. Those who are sitting in a room, we welcome feedback, because we are doing these every other month for the remaining of the year. And they are different topics. So we started out with what is equity. Our second one was child abuse, and understanding child welfare specific to our community. We are going to rotate into August, where we're going to be talking, let's talk mental health. And that is on all spectrums, both from an entrepreneurial standpoint, from a social political standpoint, as well as, and where the disparities are in our community. So you can also follow our podcast. And so we have launched a series. I think we're in now like our 10th show, and they're all related. Some of the guests here will be on those podcasts, and then we're bringing other people in. And so right now, because I think we're still in Pride Month. So we've had a series of great folks who have come in and spoke to us. So our most recent is with Rachel, who is a local entrepreneur, but a parent of a transgender child. And she talked about the journey that she's going through and what her kid is going through, in the sense of the laws that are being released locally in Indiana and Kentucky, because we understand that we are a river town and we are affected or infected sometimes also by the things that happen in other spaces.
I got one more thought if I could share it.
Brother.
Because I think I want to urge everybody the system is not broken. The system is operating exactly how it was designed to operate. So when you talk about GDP, all of the losses in GDP, like when I hear that, I think about the top 1% of wealth and how concentrated it is. They're not worried about GDP. They worry about the bottom line and what's going to their pockets, right? And so if you think about America, when it was a startup, it was based on exploitation pretty much, right? And that's how it still continues to work. And so I just want to urge everybody to think about how important it is to have counter thoughts and how important it's going to be for us to develop systems that a lot of times directly conflict with the dominant systems in which we live, and how important and scary that might be. But that's what I want to leave you with.
And I guess I just would reiterate how important it is for us all to engage in conversations that we know are uncomfortable around racial equity, and recognizing the humanity in all of us, that as we're coming to these conversations, every last one of us wants to be affirmed because of who we are and not condemned because of who we're not. And that's true of our white brothers and sisters as well. And I think it's going to be so important, particularly for white people, to feel as though they have a space and grace to be a part of these conversations, even stumbling through them without feeling like they're going to be condemned or bemoaned, because we have to have mobilized racial equity for all of the country to continue to thrive. But it can't just be this secretly held, very anger-induced, emotionally fraught conversation, because that there's no good outcomes that come from that. There's just no value really in that other than just venting. So anyway, that's how I would leave it. But, so these kinds of conversations are so helpful. Thank you so much for curating this. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that note, don't leave because I have some gifts for you two and Elise, something for you. But Rakah, the floor is yours. I thank everybody for watching the stream and everybody for showing up. Thank you.
We are HarperSlade LLC, a racial equity advisory firm. We help companies cultivate an environment where Black and brown talent can thrive and transform workplace cultures. With over 20 years' experience in human resources, employment law, and macroeconomics, our goal is to help advance a true commitment to racial equity. Through education programs, racial equity assessments, and advisory services, we're a global leader and are here to help you make a difference. Visit HarperSlade.com to learn more.